Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive deep into the world of radio and sound studies.
Let's go.
All right, so sound, right? It's everywhere. It kind of shapes how we experience, well, everything. How we connect with people, even how we see ourselves. And that's what's so cool about this field of study. It's not just about the tech stuff, it's about how sound, all sound, impacts our culture and society.
And it's been a long journey. From those early radio days to the rise of sound studies, it's a fascinating story.
Totally. So before we jump in, can you give us a little context? Like, where did this whole field even come from?
Well, it's kind of funny, actually. For a while, radio was almost overlooked in academia. Back in the 70s, film and television were all the rage, and radio was just sort of there.
Like that old dusty radio in the corner, huh? So what changed? What brought radio back into the spotlight?
People started to realize that radio wasn't just background noise. It had this huge impact on the 20th century, connecting people across the globe, spreading news, ideas, even sparking social movements.
It's easy to forget how revolutionary radio was back then.
Totally. So scholars began digging into its history, trying to understand how it shaped the world we live in.
Makes sense. So who are some of the big names who kickstarted this whole radio studies thing? What were they trying to find out?
One of the pioneers was Hugh G.J. Aitken. He was really interested in what he called radio's prehistory. Back in the mid-70s, he wrote this book, Syntony and Spark, and he argued that to really grasp the radio boom of the 1920s, we need to go back even further to the era of wireless telegraphy.
You mean like the Morse code days?
Exactly. Those crackling dots and dashes, they laid the groundwork for everything that came after.
It's amazing to think how far we've come from those early transmissions.
It really is. And Aitken, along with scholars like Susan J. Douglas,
Mhm.
they were fascinated by not just the technology, but the whole picture. The business side of early wireless companies, how the U.S. Navy was involved, and the role of those amateur radio operators, the hams.
Those hams were the original tech geeks, huh? Like building radios in their basements, connecting with people all over the world.
They were pioneers for sure. And they even played a part in shaping early regulations. Speaking of which, we can't forget the impact of the Titanic.
Oh, right. That was a major turning point, wasn't it?
Absolutely. That tragedy showed just how crucial radio communication could be, but also how much chaos it could cause without some rules in place.
Wow. So from those early days, we eventually get to the golden age of radio, right? The time of big networks, famous voices, those classic shows. What were scholars discovering about this period?
Well, this is when radio really became a mass medium, and it raised all sorts of questions. Scholars were trying to figure out how it shaped national values and attitudes.
Like, did it bring people together or create divisions?
Exactly. They were asking, why did American radio become commercially supported, unlike in Europe?
Mm.
What messages were those shows sending about race, gender, all that? It was a complex picture.
It makes you wonder how different our media landscape might be today if things had gone another way back then. But speaking of radio's commercial side, wasn't there some debate about when that really took hold?
There was. Susan J. Douglas argued that it was pretty early on, back in the 1920s, when key legal and business decisions set the stage for a commercial system.
So she saw it as a done deal from the get-go.
Pretty much. But Susan Smulyan had a different take. She dug into the archives, looking at how advertising really became dominant, and she argued that the transition from the 20s into the early 30s was actually a lot messier and more complicated than people realized.
Oh, interesting. So not quite a straight line from invention to jingles then.
Nope. And Robert McChesney added another layer to the discussion. He focused on all those groups who fought against the commercialization of radio, even though they didn't win in the end. Their efforts showed how much was at stake.
Wow. So even in those early days, people were battling over what radio should be. A business, a public service, a platform for diverse voices. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
It definitely does. And as radio studies grew, scholars started to realize that there was more to the story than just those big national networks and popular programs. They needed to look beyond the mainstream, to local radio, to different communities, to international perspectives.
Because radio wasn't just one thing, it was a whole world of voices and experiences, right?
Exactly. And those often overlooked stories turned out to be incredibly important.
Let's hear about them. What were some of the key discoveries that came from looking beyond the networks, so to speak?
For one thing, Alexander Russo's work showed us a much more diverse radio landscape than we might have imagined. He found that national, regional, and local programming were all happening at the same time, creating this layered system that offered a wider range of content than people had acknowledged.
So it wasn't just everyone tuned into the same big shows.
Definitely not. And Dolores Inés Casillas did some fascinating work uncovering the history of Spanish-language radio in the U.S.
That's a whole other world of radio history, isn't it?
It is. And her research showed how vital these stations were for Latino communities. But she also discovered that these audiences were often undercounted by those rating systems.
The ones that determine how much money stations make.
Yeah, exactly. So something as seemingly technical as a rating system actually had real-world consequences for representation and access.
That's a good reminder that even the behind-the-scenes stuff matters. What other hidden stories were scholars uncovering during this period?
Well, Brian Ward's work on radio and the civil rights movement show how activists and DJs used the medium to mobilize communities and push for change. It was a powerful tool, especially outside the mainstream media.
Wow. It's amazing how radio could connect people and amplify voices, especially in times of social upheaval. But it makes you wonder, how did scholars start thinking about the actual experience of listening to radio? Did they begin to focus more on how people engaged with it on a personal level?
They did. Scholars like Patty Scannell and David Cardiff really started to explore that. They analyzed how radio, particularly the BBC in Britain, played a role in shaping national identity. It wasn't just about the content. It was about the act of listening itself and how it created a sense of shared experience.
It's like radio became the soundtrack to people's lives, almost like a shared heartbeat, right?
Exactly. And that focus on listening, on how we experience and interpret sound, that's ultimately what led to the emergence of sound studies.
So sound studies kind of took the core ideas of radio studies and broadened the scope to look at all sound, not just
Right.
radio.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole symphony of sound that surrounds us.
I love that analogy. But before we jump into the world of sound studies, let's take a step back for a second. What are some key things we've learned so far about those early days of radio studies?
Well, I think what's really striking is how much this field was driven by a desire to understand radio's complex role in the 20th century. It's a story of technology and culture, power and resistance, and ultimately how we connect through sound. But it's also a story that's still being written, especially as our relationship with sound keeps changing.
And with so many new sounds and ways of listening emerging all the time, that story just keeps getting more complex and fascinating. All right, so we've laid the groundwork with radio studies. Let's see how this whole sound studies thing grew from there. What new insights did it bring to the table?
Okay, so we've covered the early days of radio studies and all those fascinating discoveries. Now let's shift gears and step into the wider world of sound studies.
It's like going from looking at a single instrument to appreciating the whole orchestra, you know?
Exactly. Sound studies takes that focus on listening and expands it to encompass, well, everything we hear. And I hear that one of the pioneers of sound studies was actually composer R. Murray Schafer. That's kind of cool, right? Yeah. He was really ahead of his time. Back in the 1960s, he came up with this term, soundscape, which completely changed how we think about sound.
Soundscape, huh? What does that even mean?
Well, he argued that we're not just surrounded by random sounds, we're actually immersed in this dynamic sonic environment that shapes how we experience the world.
It's like we're part of the music, not just listening to it. So what was Schaefer concerned about with these soundscapes? Was he like, modern life is just too noisy?
He was definitely worried about noise pollution, but his ideas went a lot deeper. He was fascinated by how technology, like think about the Industrial Revolution or the rise of electronic media, how all that transformed the soundscape of the world.
Like the sounds we hear are a reflection of the society we've created, right?
Exactly. And another big name in sound studies, Emily Thompson. She really dug into that idea. In her book, The Soundscape of Modernity, she explored how the science of acoustics, the study of how sound behaves, got tied up with this whole project of modernity.
So she was looking at how we've tried to control and manipulate sound to shape our environments.
Exactly. She looked at how architects and engineers became obsessed with designing spaces that sounded a certain way. Think about concert halls built for perfect acoustics, or even just buildings where they tried to eliminate as much noise as possible.
Huh. So it's like, on the one hand, we're trying to create these ideal sound environments for music and stuff, but then we're also super anxious about noise and trying to get rid of it. It's almost like a love-hate relationship, right?
Totally. And that tension between sound and noise is something you see a lot in sound studies. Noise is often seen as this negative thing, something to be controlled. But then there's also this recognition that it can be creative, expressive, even enjoyable.
It's true. Like, we try to block out noise with headphones, but then we also go to concerts and sporting events and love all that noise.
Right. It's a funny thing. Sound can be so many things at once.
Yeah.
Soothing, jarring, something we want, something we avoid.
Yeah.
And that's what sound studies tries to unpack, this whole complex relationship we have with sound.
So we've got this new field, sound studies, looking at soundscapes, acoustics, noise. What other avenues did they start exploring? Where did the field go from there?
One really interesting development was the focus on how sound connects with things like gender, race, and power. Scholars started to ask, how do these social dynamics shape what we hear? And how does sound itself reinforce or challenge those dynamics?
Oh, that's so important. Can you give us some examples of how that plays out in the real world?
Sure. Christy and Eric did some really interesting work on radio in Argentina and Uruguay. She found that even though women were participating in public discourse through radio, their voices were often marginalized or seen as disruptive.
Just because they were women.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It shows how even something like sound can be loaded with all these cultural biases and power dynamics.
Like, even the way someone speaks can be judged as masculine or feminine, and that can affect how people see them.
Exactly. And Derek Vaillant's research on transatlantic shortwave radio during the Cold War is another great example. He looked at these exchanges between the U.S. and France, and he found that even though they were supposed to be about cultural understanding, they also subtly reinforced national identities and ideologies.
Like a sonic battle of ideas, almost.
Yeah, you could say that. It just shows how sound can be this sneaky tool for shaping perceptions and even exerting power.
It's a reminder that even when we're just listening, we're never really outside of those broader social and political forces. Are there any other examples of sound studies researchers finding these hidden power dynamics?
Well, one of the newest and most interesting areas is what Mark Hagood calls Orphic media.
Orphic media. That sounds that intense. What exactly is that?
Basically, it refers to any technology designed to give us more control over our sonic environment. Think white noise machines, noise-canceling headphones, even those apps that play nature sounds to help you relax.
So we're not just trying to block out noise anymore, we're trying to create our own perfect sonic bubbles.
Exactly. And Hagood argues that this reflects our anxiety about noise and this growing need to manage our emotions through sound.
I mean, it makes sense. Our world is getting louder and more chaotic all the time. Maybe this desire for sonic control is just a natural response to that.
Maybe. It's something that sound studies is still trying to figure out, along with all these other questions about how sound, technology, and human experience are all tangled up together.
It seems like we're only just beginning to understand the power of sound and how much it shapes our lives.
Totally. And as this field keeps evolving, who knows what other amazing discoveries are waiting to be made.
I'm excited to find out. But for now, let's bring it back to radio. What are some key things we should keep in mind as we explore how radio has adapted and evolved in this digital age? So we talked about how both radio and sound studies have evolved, from those early Morse code days to these like super complex soundscapes. But in today's world with like the internet and everything, is radio still even relevant? It feels like everything's moving online.
It's a good question. And honestly, it's something people have been wondering for a while. But radio has actually proven to be pretty adaptable.
It's like that cockroach of media, it just won't die.
Haha. Well, maybe not that drastic. But even with streaming and podcasts and all that, radio is still going strong, especially local radio.
Yeah, local radio seems to be doing pretty well.
Right. It's accessible, it's connected to communities, and it can adapt to change in a way that a lot of digital platforms haven't quite figured out.
Makes sense. So what about sound studies? How is that field keeping up with this whole digital revolution?
Sound studies is actually more relevant than ever, I'd say. I mean, think about it. We're constantly bombarded with sounds from our devices, our cities, even our headphones. Understanding the impact of all that is becoming super important.
It's like we're swimming in a sea of sound. So how are researchers tackling this ever-evolving soundscape? What are they focused on these days?
Well, one big area is how digital technology is changing how we listen. Like, how are algorithms, personalized playlists, on-demand audio? How is all that affecting how we engage with sound?
It's true. It's like we can customize our listening experience in ways we never could before.
Exactly. And it raises some big questions. Are we becoming more passive listeners? Are we losing something in this process? Or are we finding new ways to be more active and in control of what we hear?
It's like we're all DJs of our own little sonic worlds now. What else are sound studies folks digging into?
Oh, tons of stuff. Another really interesting area is virtual and augmented reality. Those technologies are creating these whole new immersive sound worlds.
VR, that's a whole other level of sound, right?
Yeah. And it's bringing up all sorts of questions for researchers. How do these virtual soundscapes change how we think and feel? Do they affect how we see reality? There's so much to explore.
It's kind of mind-blowing, but a little scary too. It sounds like radio and sound studies are not just surviving, but actually thriving in this digital world.
I think that's a great way to put it. And as these fields continue to evolve and connect with other areas of study, I think we're going to see even more fascinating research that helps us understand, well, how sound shapes our lives.
I can't wait to see what they discover next. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to go out and listen to the world with a whole new perspective. What's one last thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
I think the main takeaway is that sound isn't just something that happens to us. We create it, we shape it, we experience it. It connects us to each other, to our environment, to ourselves. So the next time you put on those headphones or turn on the radio, just take a second to really appreciate the power of sound and all the stories it holds.
That's beautifully said. Who knows, maybe some of our listeners will even be inspired to join the ranks of these sound explorers, uncovering the mysteries of the sonic world.
I hope so. That would be fantastic.
Well, until next time, keep listening and stay curious. Thanks for tuning in.